Hi there, I'm Gordon Kubinek, your sponsor for today's talk, and I want to welcome you to KCOR's presentation entitled, Why Isn't the Canadian Environmental Protection Act Working? And how can it be made relevant for the 2020s and beyond? Today, we're going to start a new tradition here at the Club of Rome in Canada. We're going to acknowledge that we don't truly live the land that we live on, but we are only stewards for its future generations. So we're going to do this land acknowledgement as follows. As we begin this presentation, we acknowledge that we live on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. May we dwell on this land with gratitude and respect. When I talked with Meg and David about their talk, I did some research into this topic and was shocked to find that their statement that this act is not working is a gross understatement. I think that David's experience as an environmental lawyer and Meg's as the chair of Prevent Cancer Now, an organization whose goal is to ensure that Canada's policies that support primary cancer prevention give them the credibility to explain to you why this issue matters to you and your family. What will follow now is an approximate 45-minute presentation, followed by your questions, which you are to type in the chat box. Please make sure there are only questions, no rants, please, because I will only respond to short questions after this presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Meg and to David. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Court, for the kind introduction, and thank you for this opportunity. We're thrilled to be here and to discuss about how the Environmental Protection Act is under scrutiny right now, and if it's not working as well as it should, this is our once-in-a-generation opportunity to try to whip it into shape. So our as I mentioned, the Senate is currently considering amendments to the Environmental Protection Act. So we'd like to help further this discussion by summarizing how and what science tells us is necessary to protect human environmental health and how that can be translated into law. We're going to introduce the idea of how we really need to be implementing protections against this very rapidly increasing levels of radiation in our environment that we're using for telecommunications, this wireless non-ionizing radiation. And David is going to share with us some thoughts about regulatory failure. And if you know how things can fail, maybe you can avoid it. So just to give you a brief outline where we're going today, we'll talk about the current act and then about amendments and regulatory failure. We'll talk about operationalizing this right to a healthy environment, which is being introduced. And then I'll talk about radio frequency radiation, which is going up very quickly, and I'll give you a bit of the science on that. Today, we're building on a presentation that was given last January, on January the 5th. And in that presentation, I talked a lot more about chemicals, which is actually a major focus of CEPA. So today we're moving on to some science about radio frequency radiation and safer solutions. And then really, how can we forestall regulatory failure? So I will pass it over to David to introduce CEPA.
Thanks very much, Meg. And I should mention, by the way, I'm very honored and pleased to be here today. And as you all know, Meg is quite a wonder. She works very hard in many areas of environmental law and policy, and she truly is astounding. But she keeps me on my toes actually all the time, because she asks me very good questions about why things aren't certain ways, and so she forces me to go back and look at the history and say, oh yeah, I see where a mistake might have been made. So that's all good. In any case, I want to start today. I'm very big on understanding legal problems through the lens of history. And so the first thing that I would argue we need to talk about is the history of CEPA very briefly. And so Canada's had toxic substance legislation since the mid 1970s. And then there's been other pieces of statutes that have been one-offs, you know, consumer protection legislation that would deal or address with specific toxic chemicals found in products that are sold in retail establishments, etc. Of course, before that, we had food and drug legislation, which was brought in to address peddlers and people who were promoting suspect drugs, including Coca-Cola, I might add. Back in the 1910s, that was, of course, marketed as a very successful drug, and promoted consumption of that soft drink. So the legislation was rolled into something called the Environmental Contaminants Act, and that was on the books from 1975 to 1988. And it was apparent almost immediately that that legislation was inadequate. And there was a desire to actually bring together in one statute a whole bunch of different pieces. You know, there was legislation regarding ocean dumping and oil contamination, lots of different aspects of environmental regulation, and the sense that there was a need for an overarching federal statute. And so in 1987, the Mulroney government undertook consultations, and that resulted in the first version of CEPA, which was on the books in 1988. And then that underwent, one of the provisions in CEPA 1988 was a requirement for periodic review. And so in 1999, 98, well, actually through the mid 1990s, I would say, there was a review undertaken. And some of you may remember Charles Katcha was the chair of the Standing Committee for Environment and Sustainable Development of the federal government. And he really shepherded this through for several years. It was controversial, but ultimately it led to CEPA 99. There were some, and by the way, there were some excellent reports on the way. And some of my colleagues like Paul Muldoon, who was executive director of CEPA, of CELA, Canadian Environmental Law Association. Sorry, let me repeat that. Paul Muldoon, who was executive director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association for many years and a lawyer at CELA prior to that, he was very involved in this process. So the current law on the books is CEPA 99, and that's really going to be our focus today. We're going to be critiquing what CEPA 99 says. And we're also going to be discussing Bill S5, which is in the Senate. And for those of you, the reason it's in the Senate, it was introduced as Bill C-28 in April in the House of Commons. And to conserve legislative time, the government moved it to the Senate, which makes sense because and the other thing about the senators, as I'm sure you all know, is they actually will do quite a bit of study of bills. So important features of CEPA to understand: obviously, it's the principal law governing manufacture, import, and use of chemicals in Canada. One of the important changes made when the legislation was amended in 1999 was to focus on pollution prevention. Massachusetts had introduced legislation on pollution prevention in the 90s, mid 1990s. And this was a big, or actually, I think it was late 1980s even. And it was certainly of great interest to environmentalists and people working on health and environment across the planet. And there was a lot of interest in virtual elimination of toxic chemicals, etc., and focus on bioaccumulative toxics as well. So CEPA 99, CEPA 1999 requires the federal government to protect the environment and as well to protect human health through the application of the precautionary principle, which has proven to be challenging. So what is toxic under CEPA? To be declared as toxic, it has to undergo scrutiny in Section 64, and there are three basic provisions that will trigger Section 64. One, that have or may have immediate long-term effect on the environment or its biological diversity, or constitute or may constitute danger to the environment on which life depends. And then thirdly, constitute or may constitute danger in Canada to human life or health. So those are the kinds of triggers that will bring about chemical being designated. So to summarize CEPA, the first priority of CEPA is pollution prevention and elimination of toxic substances. The statute is regulated by both Health Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, and that makes it complicated to administer. That, I think, explains why the second priority, management of these toxic chemicals, is challenging, because priorities get blurred between environmental protection, protection of human health, protection of vulnerable communities, such as, I don't know if anyone's been following this, but there's been quite a bit of discussion about workers in nail salons, and Miriam Diamond at University of Toronto just released with her colleagues a study, very innovative study, in which they were sucking up with tiny little vacuum cleaners toxic chemicals that these workers are being exposed to every day. And then they analyzed the chemicals on the filters that have been collected, and the compounds that they're being exposed to are very serious. And it's really a risk for the children, where these women are pregnant and the children are getting these exposures as babies that are really totally, inappropriate, and they're posing a terrible burden on these families and on the healthcare system in the future too. So CEPA in theory addresses most substances other than drugs and pesticides. So it's very broad in scope, talking about substances used by industry. There's substances in products, they may be in food, and generally they're in the environment generally as well. Next slide, please. So to implement CEPA 99, there's a whole bunch of codes of practices, there's procedures, various mechanisms that the civil servants have developed over time, and they're premised generally around acceptable risk, best achievable standards that are often discussed at length between industry officials and government. There is requirement for transparency and engagement, such as the notices have to be posted on the Canada Gazette. Regulatory impact statements that have been required since 1985. Those are 86. Those have to be posted, and of course, those are over time. Those regulatory impact statements have become more elaborate and more sophisticated, but arguably they're not still looking at really key ideas that we think are necessary, such as looking at product substitution. How do we substitute very toxic chemicals and put in place other products which we know are equally effective and can achieve similar results? And the other thing is, CEPA also regulates as a regulatory gap. It also addresses the products with genetic modifications, such as genetically modified salmon, a very controversial issue in past decade, I would say. So Bill S5 is a very interesting statute because arguably it makes some important changes, and we'll get to those in a minute. But a lot of the focus is minor. I think Meg and I would take the view that many of the changes that they're proposing are fairly minor. And the really troubling aspect of the legislation is they seem to be fixing things that are not really broken, or at least from our point of view, they're certainly not broken. And we could have further discussion of that later when we're in when we go to questions. Another, like a fundamental summary of what's at play here is the fact that what's being done in the legislation deviates very dramatically from what's been proposed in previous parliamentary committee recommendations. You know, CEPA, as Meg mentioned already, this is the first time that CEPA is going to be amended in 20 years. And there have been many parliamentary committee reports in the interim, and yet quite a number of the important recommendations in those parliamentary committee reports are not being addressed at all. You know, for instance, one of the flaws in CEPA 99 is section 22, and that provides a right to investigation where there have been contraventions of CEPA. And that was modeled on the Ontario Environmental Protection Act, the Ontario Environmental Bill of Rights. And I worked for the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario for 16 years, and we were responsible for overseeing the implementation of that legislation. And section 22 hasn't resulted in, as far as I know, any, you know, if there may have been a couple of investigation requests by the public, but over 20 years, that's just shocking, because at the Environmental Commissioner's Office, we received between 15 and 30 applications for investigation for Ontario legislation a year. So the fact that there's absolutely no use of this legislation is troubling. And part of the reason is there's no accountability mechanism, that the applications would go to Environment and Climate Change Canada staff, and they could decide that they might not do anything, you know, they might just ignore it. Whereas under the Environmental Bill of Rights in Ontario, the Environmental Commissioner's Office played an accountability role and would report to the legislature each year on how those applications were handled. So that's, you know, an easy fix. In theory, you could make the Auditor General's Office, you know, Jerry DeMarco is the new commissioner there. He could be required to review these applications every year. That's an easy amendment. Why wouldn't you do that? I don't know. I mean, it's got to be a political thing, obviously. So it also, you know, they also seem to be very concerned about this lawsuit that's been brought by the plastics industry, because the plastics industry is very upset that, you know, their products are being designated as toxic under CEPA. So, so one of the solutions that Environment Canada seems to have come up with is, well, we're going to bifurcate Schedule 1 and 2, and we're going to have these super duper really toxic things, and then we're going to have these other things that we think are less toxic, and we'll give less scrutiny to them. And is that a solution? Well, the problem is that may actually undermine the constitutionality of CEPA, because as some of you may know, the constitutionality of CEPA 99 was based sort of on this, well, it's based on Hydro-Quebec decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997. And that decision ruled that chemicals have to be pretty nasty before they can warrant all the attention, the full wrath of regulators under CEPA. And now that has to be fixed, I would say. So there are things that definitely need to be fixed in Bill S5. And I won't necessarily, I won't cover them all, because they've actually been thoroughly examined by Joe Castrilli for the Canadian Environmental Law Association. So he's done a fabulous analysis of what some of those things are. And this slide presents some of the key ideas. So, you know, why aren't we imposing mandatory testing obligations on industry? You know, for decades, the industry has operated under this kind of gratis opportunity. Well, it's just an incredible deal, right? Where their products are assumed to be innocent until proven guilty. And so the government then is put in this position where it has to sort of gather all this information to prove things are not safe. And that's an incredible burden on the government in terms of testing and requirements and whatnot. Industry should be accountable. They should be doing this kind of testing themselves, and then government should get the results of that work, sort of in the same way that, you know, with all with all these vaccines that have been approved in the last year or two for COVID, initial testing was done by the drug companies, and then the government gets that, and then they do their own testing, but you start from a base. Anyway, why don't we move on to the next slide, Meg? So one of the core features of Bill F5, and this is what Meg and I really want to highlight today, is that the legislation proposes to establish a right to a healthy environment. And what we're interested in is how can we operationalize this? So I think everyone involved today would all agree that legislation should promote a healthy environment. It's just a logical thing. And I think most of the environmental groups and the civil society organizations in Canada are pleased with the fact that CEPA, this new legislation, is proposing to create a right to a healthy environment. There are some concerns. Of course, it's a tall order to do this. In fairness to the government of Canada, it is an ambitious thing to do. And there's some real fundamental issues that have to be thought about here. Not clear who the rights holders are. It doesn't appear that the right can be enforced as the language is drafted. There's a real risk that the legislation will be seen as symbolic legislation, that it's not that effective. Now, the legislation itself is very controversial and it's opposed by industry and some stakeholders, but that in itself should not be a barrier to implementing it. Establishing something like a right to a healthy environment has been attempted in other provinces. Quebec has something under its legislation, under the Civil Code, and it has worked in tandem, especially with class action legislation, which is very interesting and warrants further attention by regulators. Ontario tried to establish something like a right to a healthy environment. What's in the legislation is in the preamble. That refers to the fact that the public has such a right. But in practice, the legislation really amounts to process amendments and provides the public with a whole bunch of process tools, and then allows for an accountability mechanism, which is the Environmental Commission of Ontario. Now, that office was moved to the Auditor General of Ontario, and they've been a little less effective since then, and that's a whole separate story. So how do we modernize CEPA to create a right to a healthy environment? Meg and I have come up with these very basic ideas, which we think would take us there. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do around improving scientific methods and data gathering, because obviously decision-making can't be improved unless we have much better information at hand. And so that's really fundamental. And I would say that experts from universities and independent experts, researchers all across Canada have valuable insights that could benefit Environment Canada. Actually, we'll get to that point at the end, I guess, and how we incorporate their views and get their input. But the goal has to be to protect vulnerable populations and workers. We have to ensure that those particular people, for instance, Indigenous people have elevated exposures to many toxic compounds because of the fact that they eat more country food, whether it's deer or caribou or other species. And so we have to ensure that their populations are protected. Similarly, fish often have very concentrated contaminants that bioaccumulate. We also think that we can use the precautionary principle to promote essentiality for substitution. So what that requires is you want to look at each chemical that's currently in use, such as, for instance, PFAS, which is used ubiquitously. It's one of the gifts of DuPont to the modern world, I suppose. is the amount of use that's going on right now appropriate? How do we reduce that? And that's something that the scientists can, I think, provide a lot of insight on. There are substitutions that are available. We think very strongly that the legislation should provide a climate lens. So how do we, when we're implementing any of these changes around import substitution or around substitutions of products, etc., how do we do that in such a way that we're reducing greenhouse gases, that we're reducing waste, etc.? So these things should be complementing other federal initiatives in those areas. Our third point is that we think we should strengthen, not weaken, the listing of pollution prevention and other toxic substances. Thanks, Meg. So the other aspects of modernizing CEPA to provide a right to a healthy environment would include declaring that substances that mimic hormones, such as endocrine disruptors, are toxic. So they're clearly identified in the legislation as toxic and subject to the existing provisions, along with other current substances like mutagens, carcinogens, and reproductive toxins, which already are subject to scrutiny by the regulators. And we think that we should be regulating lookalike chemicals as groups. We should be maintaining lists of a single list of toxic substances with pollution prevention applied to all of those. We have to prevent genetic pollution via genetically modified organisms. Clear example is provided by salmon, where you see the salmon populations, the wild salmon populations mixing with the aquacultured populations of salmon and other species. So that's a risk. And then Meg's going to get to this next issue, which is regulating non-ionizing radiation used in telecommunications, which has just exploded in the past 25 years, and it's absolutely essential. I mean, in the United States, 40 million people were using cell phones back in the 90s, and now I think you'd be hard pressed. I think it's easily over 300 million people in the United States are using cell phones. And so, you know, project that into Canada and you can see the scope of that problem and how it's changed. And all of those cell phones represent new cell towers and all sorts of infrastructure, which is not properly being regulated. So I think that's where I hand it over to you, Meg.
Nope.
Or no?
You're not
Oh, I
done
have
yet.
to go on. Okay, right. Well, I'm going to quickly skip over these slides. There's a whole part of the presentation related to regulatory design. Well, how am I doing on time? I'm probably way over.
Just explain what the concept is.
Okay, so let me explain what I mean by regulatory failure here. I am really impressed by the work that's been done by Malcolm Sparrow, who's a former police officer from the United Kingdom, who came over and did a PhD. I think he might have done it at Harvard. Anyway, he's been teaching regulatory design and the regulatory craft at Harvard, primarily to government officials and also to executives in industry for about 20 years. And he's written many books. His most recent book is The Fundamentals of Regulatory Design, but he also wrote The Regulatory Craft and a very useful book called The Character of Harms. And so I strongly recommend him to you as an author. But what's really important about what Sparrow does is he's really interested in getting into the nitty-gritty. You know, what if we want to achieve success in regulatory design, we really have to focus. We have to focus our energies. We have to have agile regulators. They have to be curious, and they have to be thinking about what the long run goals of their work are. Can you, Meg, can you take me back to the previous slide, please? So all of this leads us to a discussion around the features of regulatory failure. And there are three broad themes that emerge in the public interest literature around regulatory failure. So generally, there's a failure in the design of the regulations. There can be a failure in the implementation of the regulations or the legislation. As well, there can be a perception, arguably, that the legislation or the regulations have excessive economic costs associated with them and a perceived lack of benefits by government and industry and even by the general public. Now, with respect to this last point, we would argue that this last point isn't really applicable in the context of chemicals, of toxic chemicals, because prevention of illness and cancer provides so many benefits to our society that we have to essentially recognize that the benefits of regulation of toxic chemicals are very significant. Other
MIPS release. There.
Are you okay? Meg's advanced my slides.
We're running out of time here.
We're running out of time. Okay, so I want to, this is a very useful slide, and I just want to highlight the point that often what we tend to regulate is in the middle of this Venn diagram. So it's illegal and harmful. We don't always regulate what's in the legal but harmful category. And we often will spend time regulating what's illegal, but it's not harmful. So for instance, there can be a lot of paperwork requirements, right? You know, like Revenue Canada, of course, imposes a lot of paperwork requirements on us. And it makes me laugh because sometimes, you know, you'll actually call up Revenue Canada and say, well, you know, I went through my papers that, you know, that I filed last year and I owe you $200. And the Revenue Canada officials will laugh, right? And they'll go, well, please don't send it in because you're going to create thousands of dollars of work for us. So I laugh when they tell that to me. But, you know, I'm sure they wouldn't officially say that, but often if you talk to the auditors, they'll tell you that. Like as a lawyer, that's what they'll tell me. Anyway, so I think at this point, I really do have to turn it over to Meg. So I'll leave it with you, Meg.
Thank you very much, David. So what I'm going to talk about is what I think is a terrible example of regulatory failure, because we have very rapidly escalating levels of radio frequency radiation and nobody is paying attention, and yet they can quite possibly be harmful. And so a lot of us are proposing that this really should be incorporated within the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. There's scientists around the world have been studying effects of this radiation on biota for decades, and in every species that's been adequately studied, not that many species have been studied, but everyone that has been seriously studied, they found that exposures well below those allowed by Health Canada are actually harmful. And yet at the same time, this is a very preventable kind of exposure because we can use other means for telecommunications. There's fiber optics and so on. So with clever design, this is something which could be quite easily and effectively reduced. So just to give you a very brief scientific background, the atmosphere actually blocks most of this kind of radiation as it comes from outer space. And so throughout evolution, everything on this planet has evolved without the type of radiation that we're now being exposed to from these technologies. That's one of the reasons that the technologies work so well, is that we don't have a lot of that radiation coming in naturally to interfere with it. It's increasing very rapidly, and there's different sorts of mechanisms that have been explained by scientists to say why these harmful effects are happening. Generally, proponents for radio frequency radiation and the telecommunications agents industry will say that this radiation is not powerful enough to completely knock an electron off of an atom. And that's more powerful radiation. It's so if you completely take an electron away from an atom, that's called ionization. But what this radiation does, it's not as strong, it doesn't completely remove, but it shifts electrons. And shifting of electrons is exactly what happens when you have chemical reactions. So we have this kind of catalysis. It's the speeding up of some chemical reactions more than others. So we end up with a lot of biochemical disarray, which ends up with oxidative stress and genetic damage and sensitization of cellular receptors, which can lead to way more things than we have time to talk about today. And so we're seeing that these effects are rolling out into cancers and very measurable things like sperm damage and neurological effects. And this research is being replicated many, many times. Radio frequency radiation also magnifies the toxicities of chemicals. And this has been seen in research on cancers in laboratory animals. And it's also been seen in a fascinating Korean study where they looked at the effects of lead in the children's blood and how frequently they made telephone calls. And they found the synergism that the lead plus the radio frequency radiation, they were more likely to have these developmental problems in their children. So in Canada, today our focus is more on environmental effects. In Canada, Health Canada publishes a guideline called Safety Code 6, and it states in Safety Code 6, and Health Canada repeatedly says that as long as there's not excessive heating of tissues, then there's no problem. And these are called thermal effects. But a lot of scientists and people experiencing them say that there are non-thermal effects that are very serious. So there's this kind of this rather polarized discussion going on. Safety Code 6 was originally for federally mandated workplaces, and now it's been implemented by ICED, so it's now applied for all of the devices and the infrastructure via regulation. And unlike for pesticides and substances under CEPA, there's actually no regulation or law saying how you have to do these assessments and what kind of transparency there is, what kind of consultation, this kind of thing. So there's a complete vacuum around all of the niceties of involving the public in assessment of what might be harming them. There's little, if any, monitoring of real life exposures, and there's no accounting for the extraordinary type of pulsed signals that we're using now, because it's not as if you get a very smooth waveform here. We have all of this high definition video thanks to very sharply pulsed signals. So these are not natural signals. And so in Canada, as I said, it's this wireless radiation regulation is only for people. The Radiation Devices Act applies mostly to medical equipment and tanning beds and things like that. And it doesn't mention radio frequency radiation or telecommunications. A couple of years ago, Health Canada held a consultation that nobody knew about, and only, I think it was about a dozen, they had about a dozen responses on expanding the scope of this Radiation Devices Act to cover things like cell phones. But nobody knew about that and nobody really responded. So that's kind of stalled. There are, in terms of laws, there are laws for cell tower siting, and they have this veneer of being very safe because they say it has to be consistent with the Migratory Birds Convention Act and the Species at Risk Act, and it also says it has to be consistent with the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which none of which mention anything at all about radio frequency radiation. So it's kind of hard to be in conflict with something that doesn't, pose any, it's not addressed. There are, of course, I have to, very contested hazards. One example is Health Canada. They say that radio frequency radiation does not cause cancer. Actually, they say it doesn't cause cancer or COVID, so they're half right. But the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the international body that looks at this independently, said in 2011 that it probably does cause cancer. And then a couple of years ago, when they were updating their priorities, they gave reevaluation of radiofrequency radiation very high priority because of all of the intervening research. So now Canadian and international scientists say if it was reevaluated properly with by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, it would be a known carcinogen like asbestos, et cetera. And we know that the environmental effects of modern electromagnetic radiation are not regulated at all in Canada. We have some things. We have Safety Code 6 that applies to people. There's nothing whatsoever that talks about the environment. So we know that flora and fauna, particularly birds and insects, they're very rapidly declining. And this is this radiation, this wireless deployment is actually a risk for them. There's been a large study that was put out in 3 parts in 2011, summarizing all of this. In the US, there was also a large court case with thousands of pages of scientific documents. And the US Federal Communications Commission was ordered by the court to go back and do their homework because there was no suggestion that they had even considered environmental effects of this radio frequency radiation. So that went through court in the US. And in 2015, the parliamentary committee and looked at Safety Code 6, and then the government responded to that, saying that Environment Climate Change Canada would look at that. But then we never heard anything. So last year, we put a petition into the Auditor General's office. And in that petition, Environment and Climate Change Canada confirmed that they do no assessment, no monitoring, no research, no regulation. They have nothing to do. They're totally hands off with radio frequency radiation. Oh, that was strange. Can you see my slide? Did it stop? Oh, I apologize for that. It just quit. So here we have a very important graph from a paper that was published back in 2018 of the levels of radiation from wireless devices that are typically found in the world today. It was published in Lancet Planetary Health, so it's a pretty high-powered study. The thin lines at the top are levels for short and long-term exposure limits. This is an international level, but it's similar to Health Canada's. And it's, you can see that even back in 2018, and levels have been increasing since, we're getting very close to the levels for around here. These are frequencies for mobile phones and Wi-Fi and so on. So this is a really interesting thing, that the background levels, you'll see that we evolved with very low levels. And this is not the kind of graph you usually see. This is what's called a logarithmic scale. So I apologize for that. So as each tick as you go up on the graph is 1,000 times. So if it starts at 1, it goes to 1,000, it goes to 1,000,000, etc. So we're looking at trillions and trillions increase in the levels of exposure over here compared to very low historic levels. So this is not like the kind of increases that we see with chemicals where it goes up 10 times or 100 times. We're talking about many, many orders of magnitude. It's quite spectacular how quickly this is going up, and it's going up even more quickly now because we're rolling out 5G, which is much more intensive. Now, I just want to share another little piece of science in our short time together. This is modeling that has been done. I've actually published some of this type of modeling for humans, but what happens particularly at these higher frequencies is that instead of the radiation going through and some of it being absorbed and some of it going straight through, it's like it is a kind of light, and it can get bent and it can reflect. So at these frequencies, particularly in insects, there's a lot of reflection. Once it gets into the insect, it reflects, and you have this the insect heating up a lot more than you would expect it to. And so it's a lot more damaging than you would expect if you did not do this very specialized modeling. And over here on the right, we have a graph, again, with logarithmic scales, showing how much this increases as you go along, as you increase in frequencies. So some of the older television and so on is at lower frequencies. This is the frequency that older cell phones used. And these are the frequencies that we're moving into for 5G. So you see that the efficiency of power absorption for insects is going up incredibly quickly. And at the same time, we know that if we walk, if you drive down the road, there are not very many insects on your windshield or on the front of your car anymore. It's considered an existential crisis how much insects have been falling. And then birds and insects, they can get lost. And this is odd because there was a picture here, but this is in insects and birds, they have just above the beak or in the gut, they have something called cryptochrome. And this is a material that helps the animal to orient itself according to magnetic fields. And so this is very, very important. It's key for navigation. So birds that are migrating, insects that are migrating, insects that are just navigating through fields and so on. This is like their geolocation system. And with this radiation, they're actually getting lost. And so the piece that's not showing here, it shows that these robins, if they were exposed, instead of all continuing to migrate south or north, they would just go off in every single direction. Oh, there you go. There. Oh. And then finally, in our white paper that we published, this is a summary of what's called power density. And this is very strange. I apologize. So the allowed power density is far off the far right-hand side, but at much, much lower power densities, we do have research showing that birds and insects and mammals and plants and ticks and then more birds, they are being affected at much, much lower exposure levels than are currently allowed for people. So we're looking at a factor of 50 to 2,000 times below the safety code 6, depending upon the frequency in these that was used in the studies. And all of this is available online on our website.
Meg, this is Gordon here, your sponsor. So if you could wrap it up within 5 minutes, that would be appreciated.
Perfect. Okay. Yes, so I'm sorry for the delays. So just wrapping up, in summary, why is non-ionizing radiation for telecommunications? Why should that be added to CEPA? First of all, we have no law covering this whatsoever. It's a complete regulatory legislative gap in terms of the environment, and yet it's bioactive. It's increasing by many, many orders of magnitude. It's increasing even more quickly now than before. It's very harmful, particularly for insects. And we don't know. There's a lot of information gap, scientific gaps, that it's a potential cofactor in what we are seeing and already very alarmed about in terms of declines of birds and insects, which, as I say, is an existential gap. And the guidance and the limits to protect human health do not apply to other species. The scientists say what you say about humans is not going to take care of that bouncing around of the radiation inside of insect bodies. And so this is following on from some of the things that David said. In order to have effective action on radiofrequency radiation, as well as all the chemicals that thank you very much, David, for mentioning some very important aspects there. We need to be very clear about the issues that we're going to be tackling and have a clear focus on this overarching purpose to prevent pollution, to have least toxic products and approaches. And then we need some agility. You know, it can take decades. It literally takes one or two generations to remove a toxic substance from commerce. We need to have very trustworthy scientists, and we need to be very open. This trustworthiness has really had its cloak torn off in terms of COVID. We need to have the curiosity to examine these kinds of things. We need the humility to recognize where we just don't know enough, and maybe we better be very, very careful. Industry capture is very, very important, and so we do need to have this unbiased, independent, and fair analyses. And we need to be a lot more proactive, saying, okay, we've got enough notion that there could be a harm. Can we avoid it? We'll avoid it if possible. In terms of radiofrequency radiation, alternative technologies are available. The alternatives are faster, more secure, more climate friendly. They're not as energy intensive. So, and this kind of finding is common when you're dealing with toxic chemicals. We just do it because we've always done it that way. So right now we have a once in a generation time opportunity to amend the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. There are some things we have to do to catch up with what's lagged over the last 20 years, but we need to be moving ahead with regulation of what's coming, and regulation that's going to try to blunt and address what we know is coming. And wireless radiation is a very important, very large regulatory gap that really ought to be put into the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So thank you very much. On the slide deck that will be on the website, there is a lot of materials and so on as well. So if you download that, then you will have a lot of resources. So thank you ever so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Megan, David. And now we have a thank you coming from Jean Miller.
No,
So Jean?
no, we're not going to do that just yet. We're going to go into question period.
Okay, great. So I'm the sponsor, Gordon, and I've been looking at your questions. So we'll start off with a question from Bill Pugsley, followed by John Hollins, please. So Bill, you're on, and then John Hollins is on deck, please.
Thank you, Gordon. My question is probably mostly directed to David, although I appreciate the overall presentation by both Meg and David. Given his experience with the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario and his mention of Charles Katcha, as many people realize, Charles Katcha, after he retired, played a very active role in the Environmental Advisory Committee to the City of Ottawa, as well as on KCOR. And together, he and I tried to address the health impacts of air pollution. So my question, since it wasn't really mentioned in the presentation, is why doesn't CEPA historically or in the future address vehicle emissions? And I'm thinking there of ozone, particulate matter, nitrogen, and sulfur oxides, and so on. These have been deemed as hazardous by Environment Canada standards, and that they are seen to cause, by authoritative sources, 500 premature deaths in Ottawa each year and 25,000 in Canada. So to me, it's a risk. Now, the reason I'm asking this,
could you please just stick to a direct question? Are you done with your question?
Okay, the question is, why doesn't CEPA address vehicle emissions?
Great, thank you.
I thought that spills the water.
Okay, well, Bill, it's a great question. And I remember oh my goodness, I was working for Pollution Probe and David Suzuki and I were out on, this would have been 1990, I think. And we were making a Nature of Things program. And actually, I wrote a whole program which was called the Green Quiz. And one of the questions addressed this explicitly. The question of how is it that air pollution is so badly regulated in Canada? And of course, as is no surprise to you, I expect, that it's a division of powers issue, that the provinces have the lead regulatory authority around this question. It is split up to a certain degree. So we have, if it's on federal land and it concerns a federal activity, could be airlines or trains, etc., there will be a stronger federal role for regulating it. Although there was a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1995 or 96 in which it said that the Ontario government could regulate emissions from CP rail, even though it is a primarily, you'd say it's under the Constitution, it's primarily a federal jurisdiction regulating the airlines and trains and whatnot. Now, the municipalities have actually done work on this. I mean, Montreal, for years, of course, I grew up in Montreal, and they had a terrible smog problem there for decades. A lot of it was related to the oil refineries in the east end of Montreal. Any time the wind would shift, the whole island would sort of like its own eco zone. The air pollution levels would just skyrocket. I had to get out of the city in the summer. It drove me crazy. The pollution levels were so bad in the 1970s. But I guess I would say this is an area that's ripe for the government actors to all sit down and figure out a coherent way to regulate it, because I think your point is well taken, that it's a bit of a regulatory gap. We didn't address it explicitly in this presentation, but I think Meg and I would certainly agree that that it needs to be addressed. And one thing that we did not get to in our presentation, but I did intend to include it, and Meg and I talked about it a great deal, was the fact that we do have processes for improving legislation in Canada that have been used. And I was fortunate because I actually, when I was teaching law, I would look at these with the students. So for instance, since the mid-1970s in Ontario, we've used a consensus style of development of new laws and regulations. It's worked very well, and it's addressed areas like construction lien legislation, trespass to property legislation, a whole bunch of different areas. And of course, it also was used at the federal level for the Fisheries Act to improve the habitat regulation provisions in 1986. It was used to develop WMIS and then Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act. So the point is, there is a precedent that we do have precedents for developing these new laws, and I think it could be adapted to the complexities of regulating air pollution in Canada. And the other thing that we do, which we've done in Canada but no longer seem to do much, is something called mirror legislation. We did that for WMIS and for Transportation of Dangerous Goods, whereby the federal and provincial governments enact complementary legislation that recognizes itself. And actually, the pan-Canadian legislation on greenhouse gases was also a similar, that the Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government introduced when it first took power. Is a similar idea. So I don't know, but Bill, does that sort of address your question? Not
yes,
really.
in fact, the CO2 considered or deemed a pollutant and agreed to by Supreme Court decisions seem to underline the freedom the feds have to get into this, even though it's recognized that the monitoring of air pollution is largely a provincial responsibility. The standards that Environment Canada sets makes it federal. So I thought this seemed like a real gap.
But if I could just respond to that, the court case, the decision in March of 2021 dealing with the legitimacy of the carbon tax and the ability of the federal government to regulate in that area, they were not looking at CEPA so much as they were looking at the Greenhouse Prevention Pollution Act, or whatever that legislation is. That's the basis on which they enacted the carbon tax, right? So
Right.
It was that basis on which the federal law was recognized as being valid. And if those provisions had been, if that carbon tax had been done under CEPA itself, I think it would have been harder to justify. Certainly, that's what the Hydro-Quebec case would suggest.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. Could we move on to John Hollins? And on deck is John Mayer. So John Hollins is next, then John Mayer is on deck.
Thank you very much, Meg and David. Listening to you speak makes me think our Canadian society and global society as a whole has probably got this backwards. The onus is on the victims, not on those who produce stuff to prove the quality of what it is they're doing. But my question is related to Meg's observation only for people. She was referring specifically to radiation. Is there any, does CEPA now and does S6 have any provision to look at the health and welfare of the broader Canadian or global ecosystems, or are we simply stuck with a human-oriented society?
Well, what's happened, I think that you've kind of conflated things a little bit. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the amendments to it, which is S5 in the Senate, that applies to both the environment and to health, and both of the ministries are involved with it, which, as David mentioned, makes it kind of complicated sometimes, but they do try to divide up the workload. So both health and environment are covered under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. For radiation, All we have is guidance that is published by Health Canada, and that guidance is guidance to protect human health. It started off as a workplace guidance to, protect humans in their workplace, and now it's been expanded to protect supposedly all humans, but it applies only to humans. And so with the radio frequency radiation, there is nothing, and that was confirmed by Environment Canada just at the end of last year, that they have nothing at all to do with this exposure, in spite of the fact that it's very, it's going up so fast, et cetera, et cetera. So CEPA, and that's one reason that this would be such a fantastic place for that exposure to be, because CEPA looks at both humans and the environment. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great answer. I really like that one. John Hollins is done. So we've got John Mayer on is now, and then Silko Popescu is on deck. So John Mayer and then Silko Popescu is on deck.
Hey, Meg and David, thanks very much. The information on the insects was revelatory. So thanks. I wonder about the independence of our research capabilities. How much research is now funded by industry versus in yesteryear when the environmental movement started to take off? I wonder how much is the case that governments in leading countries are still maintaining independent research. So the question is, how is the balance between the pushback from industry and the vibrancy of the investigative scientists that should be working on all of these questions in Canada? How do we compare?
Well, I think you probably know the answer. The funding, a lot of funding comes from industry. When they have done large epidemiological studies, usually that comes from, it is quite well funded by industry. Now they do put in places some mechanisms by which hopefully there's some separation between the funding and the researchers and the industry, but generally they are, they're, excuse me. And generally there's a lot more research. There's been studies done looking at the congruence between the funding and the findings. And there is quite a sharp difference there, where there seems to be high correlation between finding no problem whatsoever and industry funding versus, for instance, looking at cancer, brain tumors. There are independent researchers in Sweden who have done decades of work. First of all, this one researcher was looking at 2,4-D, the herbicide, and found that it was a carcinogen. And then he started looking at cell phone radiation, and he's produced Dr. Hardell is his name, and his group have produced a whole series of studies at different times with different age groups and taking very careful exposure histories. Recently, there was a large study that was an international study for children. And here in Ottawa, I know one researcher who was involved in this big international study. And I saw him one day and he looked so tired. And he'd been at meetings and they'd been trying to figure out how on earth they were going to characterize the exposure when kids are not putting their phones to their heads so much. So, you would expect that close exposure to result in a brain tumor. But they were, at the time when they were doing their study, kids weren't talking on the phone. They were using it, they were texting and doing whatever they're doing on their phone away from their head. So they set up this study to look at brain tumors and then realized that their exposure was really not going to result in a strong finding. And there's a definition that was put out for a catastrophe once, and that's something that can be detected by an epidemiological study, because epidemiology is by its nature, it's people in real life and everybody's different. So it's very difficult kind of work to find very definitive findings, and then they have to be replicated, and someone has to do that and be funded to replicate, and things change over time.
Okay.
Just like that children's study. So that was kind of a bust. They said, oh, we can't find anything here, which of course doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It's just that it is the way the research is done.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Great. So we're going to move on to Silka Pupescu, and then on deck is Art Hunter. So Silka, you're on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meg and David. That was a really interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you could comment on why you think that these issues aren't more of a priority for the government. Like, what do you see as the main factors leading to this change not happening in this legislation?
Well, this proposal is relatively new, but the Canadian government is apparently, at least the regulators within the Canadian government are apparently quite captured. It's actually a very small group. There's only a few people looking at this issue. There was a parliamentary committee hearing, and we brought in experts from around the world, and it was very clear that the government representatives were very, very weak. There have been a couple of reports from the health committee in Parliament, basically saying, we have to do a whole lot better. And yet it's sort of a big collective shrug. And in the meantime, the government is doling out lots of money for wireless. Everybody wants their internet, but we'd be a lot safer and more resilient, et cetera, if we actually did install a lot more fiber. And that's actually happening now. There's, rural Newfoundland is getting fiber. I don't have it in Dunrobin, but they have it in rural Newfoundland. So I think that we're recognizing, particularly since this horrible war in Ukraine, how vulnerable everything you put above ground and in the air and so on is, and that we do need to move, perhaps for other reasons, to things that radiate a lot less. So yeah, to put it briefly, there's regulatory capture, it's political.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Meg. Our next question is from Art Hunter, and then on deck is Richard Vanderjucht.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Art next, and then Richard following.
Okay, I just want to make one quick comment, and that is with regards to some of the work I did when COVID, of course, broke out, was to find ways to break that complex molecule such that it became dormant. And of course, ultraviolet band C, particularly at 258.6 nanometers, was in fact well used in Canadian industry and industry around the world, in fact, for purifying water and for preparing food, etc. But what it really does is it excites the hydrogen molecule or the hydrogen atom within a molecule, and that molecule breaks in half. It's not ionizing, and so it is non-ionizing radiation. It also led me to take a look at the whole spectrum, and I was just amazed at how much work has been done at looking at this entire frequency spectrum, going right through the ionizing and beyond, in terms of the impact on quite a number of other matter. Anyway, one might want to spend some time taking a look at that, Meg. My comment really is, or my question is, with regards to the precautionary principle, and this I find a little bit troublesome, because I suspect there's a possibility for some considerable misuse where people can can say, that something is toxic, and you can get into quite a debate. And I was also looking at the terms that were used legally, and maybe David can have a crack at this, where even defining what is toxic had it may cause, and all of a sudden there's hardly anything really definitive here, and I don't know how you handle the precautionary principle and this fuzzy language which says it may cause when you're trying to define topic. Go ahead.
Okay, should I start off? So your question has to do with toxicity testing in general. So for regulatory toxicity testing, there's various levels that are done. And so you can, for instance, look at the way a particular chemical will react, like the water molecule breaking up and so on. So they actually have now very sophisticated in vitro testing to see if a particular molecule will bind, say, with hormones. Because if it binds with a hormone, the hormone won't work, or if it binds on that hormone receptor, then it also will have biological effects. So now we have a whole suite of chemicals that will raise red flags. And a lot of this is based on testing in vitro, like in test tubes, and then testing, things like cells, yeast cells, and so on. The first test for mutagenicity was on yeast cells, and then insects and moving up, and there's an awful lot of rats that have died for the sake of toxic chemicals. And then the human studies, it's not ethical to do any kind of trial on a chemical unless it's a drug and the trial participant has a possibility of reaping a benefit. So I can't just say, well, I'm not sure if this chemical is toxic or not, but you can have it in your Cheerios for a couple of weeks and we'll see what happens. That's clearly not ethical. So and that's why for all of these chemicals, once they're on the market, we have to go back and look at them. And that's what happens with pesticides. However, with regular chemicals, we don't even really know how much is in commerce and so on, because the companies don't have to say very much until they reach certain thresholds. So at a certain threshold, I've got this chemical name. And then another threshold, this is how much that chemical weighs. And this is it, what it will dissolve in or how quickly it vaporizes. But you only get quite a bit of information once we have fairly substantial exposures already. So there's that kind of ethical issue. But as far as determination of toxicity, it is always contested. We have and that whole in vitro laboratory away from the real world kind of testing is getting strengthened a lot in Europe. They're really moving towards that because they are moving to, in Europe, they're talking about essentiality and so on. But we know from experience that these lookalike chemicals actually act alike as well. So you heard about bisphenol A in baby cups and baby bottles, and that's the clear plastic. So they said, no, we're not going to have any more of that. And recently the Canadian Health Measures Survey said, good news, we restricted it, people know about it, and so BPA is going down in humans. But there's BPS, there's BPX, there's a whole alphabet soup of bisphenols. And so these are being substituted, and the Canadian Health Measures Survey did not look at any of the substitutes. And now we have research showing that they're at least as toxic and some of them are worse. So until we really get kind of clamp down on this huge forest of chemicals and say, we're going to look at all the bisphenols together. We're going to look at all these plastic softening things, phthalates. We're going to look at them all together. And so under CEPA, you don't necessarily, it's kind of at the end game where they say, no, this is so bad that we've really got to take some serious action. CEPA is also supposed to be protecting us or limiting, things that aren't quite so bad. But what I'm saying is that instead of focusing on, is it good enough, we should be really shrinking our chemical footprint, as it were, and saying, okay, what is the purpose of this? Do we need it? There's been a lot of talk about the fluorinated chemicals like Teflon and waterproofing. And in Europe, they don't use them anymore. And if you go to a lot of the places, the outdoor gear, they don't use it anymore. We've had that research for decades that this has biological effects. And now we realize that there are cancers in high levels of cancers in communities where this is in their groundwater, et cetera. So we're very, very slow to pick up on the actual toxicity of a lot of substances. And it's a problem under CEPA, it's a problem for pesticides as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, actually, I
thank
would
you very
add
much.
one other thing is the imagination. There's a list of all the things that a good regulator would do. Just as an illustration of lack of imagination, for fluorinated chemicals, we know that very small molecules disrupt the ozone layer. They destroy ozone. And we know that very big chemicals they disrupt the endocrine system. So we get cancers and reproductive problems, all sorts of things at that end. So the tiny ones are bad, the big ones are bad, but don't worry, because the chemical companies told us that there's a Goldilocks zone. And so that's where they've gone. So now we have all these sort of supposed Goldilocks zone fluorinated chemicals, but spoiler alert, they're toxic as well. So we should know better by now on a lot of different things, on radio frequency radiation, on chemicals, and yet we're constantly being sold a bill of goods. And if we had regulators who were backed up, who had that imagination to say, hang on, I've heard this story before, this is a slightly different tune, but I think it's also not a very good one. So it's a big puzzle. There's a lot of pieces, but I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Meg.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to move on to the next gentleman. He's just about to leave. So Richard, can you please ask your question? And
Yes.
I'm on deck. So Richard, go.
Well, thank you. I think Meg knows where I'm going with this, but this was a nice segue. Your last question, Meg, can you just tell the group what it would take to inform the decision-making process in Canada?
Well, basically, if you want to do, if you're going to be looking at what is happening in humans, then that requires a lot of data. And actually, it's a physician who introduced this bill into the Senate, who is a physician, who was very keen on this as well. And he said, we are going to need to spend a lot more money if we're going to keep Canadians safe, because we're going to have to be tracking better what chemicals are in their bodies. So if you're looking at bisphenol A, look at the other bisphenols as well. But basically, we would need that data, and we would need to be able to link it to health data and to location data. And this is something which is coming along in terms of harmonization of our health data across the country. But we are very short of data, and we don't have that kind of infrastructure to confederate the exposure data that we do have. For instance, air pollution is something we have more information about. Canada has produced some very interesting research on air pollution and cardiovascular and neurocognitive things. But actually, Richard has been promoting the idea of the Canadian Environmental Health Information Infrastructure, which would be a way to bring together that data so that you could start to draw these connections. more quickly than you would if you wait for generations before deciding that, you know, DDT causes breast cancer in grandchildren, if you can imagine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for the
I
question.
understand that David, our other co-presenter, you wanted to add something to Art's question, so to complement what Meg said. So David McRobert, you're on, so you can add to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gord. I just wanted to make the point that to address the precautionary question, and it's a really important one that Art raised. It's really vital to keep in mind that that concept of the precautionary principle came out of discussions around climate change. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in some of those discussions in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I attended some of the climate change negotiations. And so that led up, so the basic gist of the idea was we don't know exactly how dramatically what's happening to the atmosphere is going to change what, you know, various biological processes and geochemical processes on the earth, etc. How all of that is gonna spin out. Now, of course, 30 years hindsight, we can say, wow, you know, it's actually turned out to be, you know, pretty bad. But at the time, what many of us who were environmental advocates were saying is we need to take a precautionary approach to this because we think that it's going to have very dramatic impacts. And there are going to be things that happen, such as the flooding of the small island nations, that are going to be irreversible. And just it's for those people, it's essentially the end of their livelihoods. You know, that's the end of everything for them. They are forced to migrate, and we have to be mindful of the consequences. And so that, I think, was where this idea of the precautionary principle first really took hold, and then it began to expand to other realms. And so in Ontario, under the Environmental Bill of Rights, there were 14 prescribed ministries originally, and each of those had to have something called a statement of environmental values. And those statement of environmental values were intended to be a kind of overarching framework that each ministry, that the civil servants would look at when they were deciding how to make decisions. So that speaks to some of the other questions people have raised about decision making. And the idea behind the Environmental Bill of Rights was that civil servants and the minister, both of them together, would be looking at scientific, economic, and environmental factors and deciding how to apply concepts like the precautionary principle, such as pollution prevention, etc. The first articulation of the principle of the precautionary principle in law in Canada was in obiter dicta. In other words, by the way, comments by Claire Leroux-Dubé, a Supreme Court justice, in the Hudson case, which of course was the case that reviewed whether or not the constitutionality of a municipal bylaw on pesticides. So that winds back to an earlier question from Bill Pugsley about, you know, the authority of municipalities to regulate. Well, arguably, municipalities need to have more power. They should have more power around non-ionizing radiation. They should have more power in many of these realms, and yet they don't, because of the way the Constitution is divided and the fact that the provinces are supposedly responsible, you know, that the municipalities are creatures of the province in law. And of course, that was confirmed in the recent case that went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, whereby Doug Ford passed this legislation very quickly, amending the electoral districts in Toronto, and he did it in the middle of the election, as some of you may recall, and that went to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada said, yes, yeah, that's true, the province can do that, even though it's incredibly undemocratic. And now I think many of us around the room would say, wow, we really need to reform the Constitution. Of course, we know how hard that will be because we need 7 out of 10 provinces representing 66% of the population. And that's thanks to Pierre Trudeau. Thank you, Pierre, for that amending formula. But it's going to be quite hard to do what probably needs to be done in order to fix the Constitution around environment, democracy, all these things. So I just, but there has been an effort to use concepts like precautionary principle, how far they could be used to advance discussion. They certainly help to inform the debate. And I strongly, it's wonderful that we have that kind of dialogue going on, because I think it's really important educational wise. People understand, wow, we should be protecting the health and safety of the public, et cetera. Anyway, I just wanted to add those points. Sorry for taking so much time.
Thank you, David. I'm next, and then Vic Buxton is after me. And I have a question for you, David. When I was doing some research for this presentation, I found that an article that said cadmium, which is one of those things on the toxic list, has increased 900% just between 06 and 12. I also read that in 2013, we also had 18 times more suspected carcinogens emitted in the air than New Jersey, which supposedly has a similar sized and makeup of chemical industry to Ontario. So we're 18 times more toxins emitted than New Jersey. I focused in on that because it's personal. I lived in New Jersey, and I always assumed coming back to Canada, I would be in the land of the free and the brave, and the water is clean and everything. And I discover that shockingly, it's not true. So how is it that we're way behind New Jersey? Like what happened? When I was a kid, we always looked down upon the Americans. Things were so much better here. And clearly, in terms of this domain, at least, we are so much worse. So what the heck happened in Canada? And I think this is a bit of a cultural question. And since you have both gray hairs, but I'm going to say that, David, you have more, just to be polite, right? And you have, and I do as well. So what happened?
Well, I would like to share time to respond on this question with Meg, but I will say this, that Ontario, being the industrial capital of Canada, has for decades, if not more than a century, probably turned a blind eye to some emissions. Now, some of the cadmium is definitely from our heavy industries, like for instance, when you're, the nickel industry, the nickel processing process, that's generates, as I understand it, a great deal of cadmium. For years, we didn't really regulate that fully. I think the ambient cadmium levels in the natural environment were already pretty high by the time we started to look at this pretty carefully. And Ontario actually did they did studies around background levels of many chemicals like lead and cadmium back in the 80s and 90s. And they published this huge report. It's a huge report about background levels of many of these chemicals. So they're already in the environment and they're circulating. In Ontario, of course, the Ontario government, the Liberal government, passed a Toxics Reduction Act in 2009. And the Ford government has actually repealed that. And as part of an analysis of how that legislation was working, Joe Castrilli looked at these very questions that you're raising, Gord. And indeed, as you say, Ontario's performance relative to New Jersey and most other jurisdictions, I think we're the third worst jurisdiction in North America and on many air pollutants, and we're the fourth worst on air and water in many toxic compounds for air and water. So nothing to brag about in Ontario, and it's absolute travesty. Now, how we fix that, the question is, why isn't Environment Canada more engaged with it? And I would say there's been this constitutional There have been arguments back and forth between the provinces and the feds as to the lead, but now it seems to have, Ontario's handing it back to the federal government and saying, okay, you deal with this. And at that point, Meg, you could speak to this, I think.
Yes. Well, just to start, when you say that cadmium has gone up, are you talking about air or water or blood?
I'm just can only refer to the article. The article that I read just said there's been a 900% increase in Canada. So it doesn't say in the article air or water. So I don't know.
Okay, because as David said, there are industrial sources of cadmium. There is cadmium in coal, and so that should have gone down with reduction of coal, burning thermal coal. I actually did a huge project on arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and lead, which was a very dismal kind of thing to be looking at. But cadmium is interesting. It's chemically similar to lead, and it's sort of like lead on steroids when it comes to a lot of its toxicities. So it's about 300, the acceptable limit in water is about 300 times lower than in lead. But we know more about lead because we've used it a heck of a lot more. And I'm kind of concerned about cadmium in people, because in parts of Canada, there's actually very high levels of cadmium in the soil. And so people can get it naturally in their groundwater or through their food. And with the pesticide glyphosate, it's a herbicide. That's what, Roundup. You have Roundup ready crops that can be doused with glyphosate, and the crops will survive and all of those nasty weeds will die. At least that's the plan until we have Roundup ready weeds. Anyway, glyphosate, before it was actually commercialized as a plant killing thing, a herbicide, it was also patented as an antibiotic, and it was patented as a chelating agent. And a chelator is a chemical that can wrap itself around a metal ion and pull it into the water. So the metal might be just kind of stuck on its little piece of rock or something, but a chelator will bring it into the water and mobilize it. And it can put it up into plants. And so Environment Canada back in the 90s had a huge database of plants that were more likely to do this, to accumulate cadmium out of the soil. And so there's actually problems for people who eat a lot of food off the land, because this cadmium, it accumulates in the liver, it accumulates in the heart. So eating organ meat will give you a lot of exposure to cadmium. Another plant that is very good at hyperaccumulating cadmium is tobacco. So if you're a tobacco smoker, you're going to be exposed to a lot more cadmium than regular people, and people who breathe in the smoke, the particles, will also be exposed to cadmium. So I'm not sure where, which cadmium you're talking about, because it is a naturally occurring thing that's in quite a few different instances, in quite a few different contexts, but it's in our natural potash fertilizer. It's high in Canadian potash. So
thank you, Meg.
I don't know.
Thank you, Meg.
I'd have to have more details, but that gives you some ideas. We'll
talk afterwards. I'm at the point, I'm going to ask you, Vic Buxton, to hold your question for the informal chat session. And I would like Jean Doherty to now give our official thank you to the presenters. So Jean, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Meg and David, that was a very, very interesting conversation and discussion that you had with respect to various aspects of things that have been so-called falling apart in Canada, if you will. And just really, really interesting discussion that has been had, very wide-ranging. And I really, really appreciate you bringing all of these things up to our audience today. And for the audience today, if many of you may or may not be Canadian CACOR members, and if you're interested in finding out more about CORE, please go on to the canadian.core.com website and look at all of the various things that we have available for you. On that website, you can actually see how to become a member, but also you should be looking at the Stay Informed section of the KCORE site, because there you will see all of the new things that are coming on a regular basis, including the talk that we've had today and the record of that coming up, and all of the other talks that we've had in the past. It's a phenomenal resource for anybody who wishes to look at things, and please go onto our website and look. So on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would really like to thank you very much for a very informative talk today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. And our formal part of the presentation is now over.